Hello, Sophie and Emily. I have an agony aunt question for you. The person says not for me, but I think it might be relevant to many of us, actually. What do you do if you're afraid of your child? Teens can be so difficult. So we can start with teens, but actually I think we can be afraid of our children through their lives. And
That's
you're
it
both
with
smiling at
feeling,
me.
Mum.
Yes. Shall I start?
Sure.
I think I don't even know what's going to come out of my mouth. So I haven't verbalized this to myself before or to anybody. So I may retract it afterwards.
So that's very caveated, Mum.
It's very caveated because this is a very caveated type of conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that what is presumed and assumed is that the parent has power over their children and has more power than the children. And certainly with young children, that is true because you can pick them up and you are very powerful. But I think emotionally and psychologically, because most of us, I can't speak for everybody, love our children so much, they have enormous power over us to kind of, if I'm a bad parent, I feel bad, or if I've upset them, I feel bad, or if they really hate me, that is deeply upsetting. We talked about hate before, where quite a lot of friends said to me, I've never hated my children, by the way, which was interesting.
They mum shamed you. No.
They mum shamed me. And I had quite a few messages on Instagram. So there's all my caveats. But what I'm saying is I think there is much more reciprocity of power in the relationship and that we can be afraid of our kids. It doesn't mean that we don't love them, or I think it's part of parenting maybe even. And it isn't talked about.
Yes, I think it's definitely possible to be afraid of your children. I think that in general, though, particularly with younger children, which I think a toddler tantrum can be a scary thing to behold. So I think it's possible to feel afraid in the sense of overwhelmed by a young child.
Well, and shamed, like if they're screaming at you in the supermarket and kicking you.
Sure. And obviously, like you say, Mum, the difference with teens is they're physically much bigger and more powerful and potentially stronger than you. I think for most children and teens, the experience of it does not feel like your parent is less powerful than you. Or I actually think that if you feel your parent doesn't have power, that's actually quite a frightening feeling and quite a frightening experience. And I think it is, I don't know whether you're afraid physically or whether it's your teen is being very complicated and having big emotional difficulties. And your response to those would be different because if you are afraid for your safety, that's really a situation where you do need to get active help. If it's more, which I think is very typical, your teenager is feeling a lot, expressing a lot, having a lot of really big emotions and moods, which is totally what you would expect from any teenager. I think it's about supporting yourself because it can be really overwhelming to have a lot of really big feelings. But actually what your teen needs from you is the same as what a toddler needs from you in some respects, which is to be regulated, to be calm, to try and understand their perspective and empathize and validate while maintaining age-appropriate boundaries. And the fear is maybe because you never got to do that. Maybe you never got to have really big feelings that were regulated. Maybe feelings are frightening for you. And so I would encourage you to reflect on like what the fear is, like where that comes from. Often to break it down, or maybe it's that your parents had very scary feelings that were never regulated and they had big fights, and that feelings for you are therefore not resolved. They just end in bad things happening. They don't end with repair. So I would also encourage you to reflect on your own experiences from younger in like your primary relationships and your other relationships around intense emotion and what that experience has been like for you. But with your teen, the more you're able to, even if you're kind of faking it a bit, like stay ostensibly calm, try and understand their experience and have boundaries. That's what I would encourage you to do.
I remember when we talked in the past, this would be probably years ago now, and you worked with a model, probably still work with a model called Circle of Security or something like that.
Yeah,
and it has this phrase for parents to be stronger, wiser, and kinder.
Bigger, stronger, wiser, and kinder.
Bigger, stronger, wiser, kinder. What's the bigger bit mean?
Bigger just means like that they feel sort of safe with you, that they feel that you're kind of in charge.
I definitely found it as a useful kind of touchstone, because I know when my children can get really emotional about something, particularly, but obviously when something presses a button in me, right, I'm feeling out of control, or I'm not sure it's the right decision, or something from my own childhood, or whatever it might be, I can get quite caught, potentially have been caught. And that phrase just reminds me to be in my adult self. Like stronger, wiser, kinder. Like that's my adult self. That's the person that my child needs in this moment, not the other parts of myself, which might also have lots of feelings, but my children don't need to be the recipients of those parts of me, if that makes sense. That I need maybe go talk to a therapist about, talk to my husband about, talk to a friend about. I find this really hard when ... But trying quite hard, I just found that useful as a touchstone for staying in my more adult self when I'm with them, rather than the part of me just wants to scream, just do what I'm telling you to do, or whatever.
Yes, right. And I think, to add on to that, Sophie, is to acknowledge how hard it is. Like, it is incredibly hard. You won't be able to do it all the time. I'm a child psychotherapist, and I lose my rag with my children, like definitely more than I would want to, and that bit's okay too. It's about the repair after.
My last thought is, I think when we get frightened, it is likely to be much more about us than it is about the person that's frightening us. I mean, as you said, Em, if it's a physical threat, then you need to get active support. But if I'm feeling really afraid, it is more likely that it goes back to an early wound that happened in me than it is that my 6-year-old child is actually terrorizing me because they're just being themselves.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's really, really helpful to think about your own experiences. And I think the other thing is when you feel like I can't get my teen, my child, whoever, to do what they're supposed to do, that I think also creates a lot of shame. Like, I'm their parent, I'm supposed to be able to make them
get them out the door,
do their
by 8 o'clock.
homework, do their revise, not smoke weed, whatever the thing is. And I think that feeling of powerlessness and that feeling of shame, it's such a powerful kind of toxic mix. And often what happens is then it gets kind of projected out onto the child. So then you get furious with the child, or you're afraid of the child. And actually it's coming from a place of sort of shame and powerlessness, and to kind of take care of that part to sort of stop you making the situation worse by sort of like projecting it back out onto your child, I think would be a useful framework, I guess, of like thinking, oh, like what is this doing internally to me when so-and-so doesn't do this or does this.
I just want to add one more short thing that's just referencing back to what Mum you were sort of speaking to at the beginning. Is one of the things I was hearing you say, Mum, was that because you really love your children, then they can really hurt you. And because they can really hurt you, then can be scary. Like, oh, this person could really hurt me. And so I think there's a truth to that there, like where you often say where you love most is where you can hate most, but certainly where you can hurt most because you're most invested in those relationships. And I guess underpinning that is how much do you trust, and this might not be to do with that relationship individually, it could be to do with your relationship history and childhood history, that even if you hurt each other, that you can make it better again.
Okay.
Because that is gives you a much wider window of tolerance of how much you can bear your child being angry with you. If you feel like this is irreparable and they're going to wound me and I'm never going to recover and this could rupture forever, then you're coming to the idea of being hurt by that person with an enormous amount of charge that makes them being angry or upset with you much bigger than the fact that they're just angry and upset with you and you want to get to a better place. Whereas,
and I think there's also often the fear alongside that of like, have I fucked up? Like,
forever?
Am I a terrible parent? Like, why is my child doing this? Is it because of something I've done? These are all very painful, difficult things. And because you have an angry teen, it definitely doesn't mean that you've messed up as a parent. There might be all sorts of things going on, and only some of them will have to do with you. But I think that sort of where you love most and
feel most.
Parent and feel most, but also every parent I've ever met in any context always wants the best for their child, even if they're in a very complicated, difficult relationship and they do feel like they hate them some of the time, always they wish the best. And then also alongside that is thinking, what am I doing? Or is it maybe not? It's not always what is that? What am I doing? but I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes you also have a tendency to kind of think, have I made this happen? Have I done something wrong here? And that can be a useful question, but it can also be a very painful question that comes
igniting one. Because I think the regulatory framework that links to both of what you're saying is, if I have basic trust that we can repair and basic trust that we can come back together, it won't be straight away, that allows for a lot of fracture, a lot of difficulty. If I basically trust that I loved enough, imperfectly, and because it takes the bilateral all fail out of it. It creates much more, in a sense, of abundance, of capacity, that we'll get there in the end. And I think once you take the urgency out and the kind of terror of I've done it wrong forever, and trust that fundamentally you'll get there in the end, I think that's really helpful in calming your whole system down and the relationship down. So on that point, we've come to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for the person that sent in the question. Do please continue asking us questions. We really like these Agony Aunt segments. And do share the episode with anyone you think will find it helpful. And thank you for listening.